Hey there, Stafford Crossing, Pastor Dave here with the first installment of our videos in the Ask It series, where we're answering questions that people have submitted to us about faith and God. We began the series this past Sunday with questions about the Bible. Where did the Bible come from? How do we know it's reliable? How do we understand this or that in the Bible? And following one of the services, a lady came up to me and asked me a question about the different versions of the Bible. She said, there's like a bazillion versions. How do I know which ones are good and which ones I should read, and maybe even which ones I should stay away from? So I thought this would be a great question to answer in our first video for this series, because there are a whole lot of versions of the Bible. Now, we have so many different versions of the Bible because none of the Bible was written in English. It was all written in Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic, and very, very few of us read those languages. And so we need translators to translate the Bible from the Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic into English so that we can read it for ourselves and understand what God is saying to us, and that is a beautiful thing. But we end up with so many different versions because different groups of translators have done this over the years, and they've had different objectives or different techniques as they do this, and so we end up with different versions. And there are a lot of versions that I am not aware of, that I don't use, that I've never read, and so I really can't speak to any of them. What I want to do today is just share about a few versions that I use myself, that I am familiar with, and you can let this be a baseline of comparing different versions and different translations that you encounter. All right, so there's a spectrum of translation technique. On one end of the spectrum, you've got a literal translation technique, a word-for-word translation, where the translators took the word in the original language and they tried to find the most appropriate word in English and did that word for word from original language to English. And that was what we call a literal word-for-word translation. An example of that would be the New American Standard Bible. That is a word-for-word translation. The English words are as close as we can get, the most appropriate English word to that original language word. On the other end of the spectrum is what I call a paraphrase, right? And paraphrases don't even always start with the original language. Sometimes, oftentimes, they'll start with an English version and then work from there and try to make it even more readable or more interesting or just worded differently for its purpose, all right? And an example of that would be The Message. The Message began with an English version and just tried to word things a little bit differently, still accurately, but differently. And so it's a paraphrase. It does not go back to the original language. They're not translating the original language, but paraphrasing the English version already. So we've got the New American Standard, very literal. We got the Message, which is very loose. It's a paraphrase of English. And then we have some versions that fall in the middle, right? And here at Stafford Crossing, by and large, we use the NIV, the New International Version. That's what we use in our services. When we're preaching and teaching, we're working from the NIV version. And we find that connects with a lot of people, the broadest group of people. It's understandable, it's easy to read, and yet it is a good translation, all right? It's not as literal as the New American Standard, but it is a translation, not always word for word. Sometimes it's thought for thought. They'll take a thought from the original language and say, boy, if we said it this way in English, it would really be easier to read and understand. And so they've translated the thought, not always the word for word. And that has some good strength to it. So we really use the NIV, the New International Version, as our main version that we are working with. Another one that's very similar to that is the ESV, the English Standard Version. And when I read the two side by side, the ESV and the NIV, they are almost identical most of the time. Sometimes the ESV will be a little more literal, a little closer to the New American Standard than the NIV, and so but it's right there. And then there's also the New Living Translation, the NLT. And I've got it closer to the paraphrase than the NIV, simply because I feel like that's where it belongs. It's called a translation, but it feels a little more paraphrase than translation to me, and so I've got it there. And so these are 5 versions that I am familiar with, that I have used and do use in my own life. And let me tell you how I do use them. On a day-to-day basis, when I'm reading for myself, when I'm reading a passage with someone else, I'm using the NIV, the New International Version. Sometimes the ESV, but most of the time it's the New International Version. It's good, it's reliable, it's accurate, and it's easy for people to understand. I will also use the New American Standard when I really want to get down and really want to drill down in a passage and be very confident that I know what the literal translation is to English. And so I'll use the New American Standard when I'm really studying. If I'm working on a sermon, I'm definitely working in the New International Version, giving some foundation from the New American Standard, but always, working out of the NIV, because that's what we're going to be using in our services. Once I've done my study work, either in the NIV, ESV, or New American Standard, then I might turn to the New Living Translation or the Message for a different flavor on what I understand. So I've reached my understanding, and because of my study in these more literal versions, and then I'll bring in one of these other versions just for a different perspective or a little different flavor. Sometimes I really like the flavor and perspective that I find in the Message. Sometimes I think they really messed that one up, and I'll just kind of forget that one, right? But these paraphrases just add a little devotional flavor, a little different perspective on what I've already studied, and feel confident in my understanding there. So if you're thinking, 5 different versions, really? Just give me one. Just give me one. And I would recommend, if you're like, boy, I'm really going to focus in on one, I would recommend first the New International Version. Second would be the English Standard Version. Both of those are going to be great daily readings. They're accurate, they're reliable, and they're going to mesh well with everything that you're hearing from us here. And so there will be some consistency there. Why do we have so many versions? Because different people with great intentions have taken the original languages to English. They serve different purposes, they have different value as we use them in our lives. But as we read, let's rely on the Holy Spirit to really open our eyes and our hearts, and to know and to remember that God intends for the Bible to be understood. And He is with us, and He is teaching us and helping us as we do that. So God bless you guys. I hope as you dig into the Bible, as you're reading one of these different versions, that God is inspiring you and revealing to you more and more of Himself.